Hello and assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jawad Khan from MLFA, Muslim Legal Fund of America. Thank you for joining us for our virtual town hall today in our series of town halls addressing a lot of different topics around the issue of Gaza and student encampments, protesting, and many other things. Really excited to have you all join us today for Palestine exceptions to protests on campuses. We'll be joined today by Chelsea Glover, who is our senior staff attorney with MLFA's Civil Litigation Department. How you doing, Chelsea?
Good. Thank you, Jawad.
Before you start, before you start, just wanted to introduce you. Chelsea has represented clients in both the state and federal court systems and is a member of the J.L. Turner Legal Association and Dallas Women Lawyers Association. She received her JD and LLM in International and Comparative Law from Duke University School of Law in 2015, and previously completed her bachelor's degree at Harvard University. She's been recognized in 2022 and 2023 as a best lawyer once to watch in antitrust. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Chelsea to get us started.
Thank you, Jawad. Hi, my name is Chelsea Glover, and I'm the Senior Staff Attorney in MLFA's Civil Litigation Department. And today I would like to talk to you about what are so-called Palestine exceptions to campus protests. You've probably heard this phrase before, the Palestine exception to free speech or the Palestine exception to academic freedom. And what it refers to is a pretty obvious effort by the public to shut down any pro-Palestinian discourse, even while they claim to be in support of free speech. So without further ado, I'll get started by first explaining the First Amendment and then going into the law specific to student protests. First, as we all know, the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment protects our right to protest. The First Amendment protects your right to speech and expression and the rights of assembly, and the 14th Amendment extends that right to the states. So as it pertains to schools, there is a pretty noticeable difference between the First Amendment's application to public versus private schools. Public schools, which are operated by the state, are entitled to full First Amendment protection. On the other hand, private schools are not necessarily entitled to full First Amendment protection. Some schools are religious schools, they may be military schools, or schools with some kind of purpose or ideological purpose where they are allowed to limit your speech rights. However, the majority of private schools choose to give full First Amendment protection to their students as an academic freedom principle. And so that specifically, you hear that in relation to the Ivy Leagues or the just pseudo Ivy League private schools. Harvard, Columbia are in the news a lot. They explain that they give full First Amendment protection to their students, but they are not required to do so. And so in general, you should remember that private schools have a much greater freedom to limit speech and protest on campus because they are not legally bound by the First Amendment the same way that a state school is. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to first state factually that there is no actual Palestine exception to the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects all speech, it doesn't protect all speech, but it protects all nonviolent speech, including pro-Palestinian speech and pro-Palestinian protests. However, both legally and socially, there is a lot of pressure to limit free speech related to Palestine. First, let's look at federal law, or at least federal acts of Congress. Shortly after October 7th, the House of Representatives voted on a resolution to basically condemn the phrase "from the river to the sea" and to state, not legally bindingly, but to just state outright that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And while that resolution doesn't have any legal effect, it has a clear chilling effect when administrators are considering whether to allow certain protests on their campus. Similarly, this year, Congress passed a resolution to HR 6090 to change federal anti-discrimination laws to basically allow a definition of anti-Semitism that includes criticism of Israel to be the law for the Department of Education when they conduct their investigations. And this will have the effect of saying students who are advocating for Palestine are actually not as protected as students advocating for Israel, because those students advocating for Palestine are criticizing Israel. And that is a different type of speech. So next slide, please. Not only is the federal government expressing this condemnation of pro-Palestinian speech, but so are states. Now, on this slide, I have an example from Texas, where we are located. You may recall when Trump was president, a lot of the governors or the Republican governors made big shows of their commitment to free speech, including Texas. In 2019, Texas enacted a law protecting free speech on college campus under full First Amendment protection. However, in March of this year, Governor Abbott issues an executive order that specifically criminalizes certain types of pro-Palestinian speech as anti-Semitic. I say criminalize, that's not particularly fair. It punishes such speech. As you can see, back to the last slide. Yes. As you can see, one of his directives is to specifically change policies to include certain types of speech as anti-Semitic and therefore punishable by expulsion. And then to direct those policies against certain groups, such as Students for Justice in Palestine or Palestine Solidarity Committee. Those are explicitly stated in this executive order. And then to adopt a different definition of anti-Semitism in violation of the First Amendment. So while the First Amendment does protect pro-Palestinian speech, a lot of states are acting like it doesn't and issuing these non-legally binding orders, or at least orders that don't hold up to legal scrutiny, and claiming that they can now, send the police in to criminalize all any pro-Palestinian conduct. Next slide, please. And then there are the actual state responses to the protests that we've seen. I've just got a couple of examples, but notoriously, especially in not just the South, but also in California, also in New York, across the country, state governments are sending in the state national troops and local police forces to clear out these protests. Once again, signaling to students and to anyone watching that pro-Palestinian advocacy is not entitled to the same protection as any other type of advocacy. Next slide, please. Finally, one of the bigger pressures on specifically private schools is donor influence. Donors give substantial amounts of money to the school, and as such, they are withholding their donations to exert pressure to force the schools to change policy as they see fit. And recently, as you saw, immediately after October 7th, a lot of donors made public statements of withholding large sums of money from these schools. And then recently it has come out that similar donors have been reaching out to mayors and state legislators to convince them to take greater action against pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel speech on campus. All of this combines to suggest that there's a great public criticism that for as much as the United States values its First Amendment, that First Amendment value reaches a wall when it comes to Palestine. That's why we call it a Palestine exception. Next slide, please. So what are some examples, or what are some signs that there may be a Palestine exception to protests on your campus? One, maybe the protest rules changed all of a sudden. For example, after October 7th, or before October 7th, protests happened in controlled environments, certain locations. After October 7th, or after the first pro-Palestinian protests, now protests are now moved even further away from the public. There are now new rules. You have to get so many hours of advance notice. You're limited to so many protests a month. These rule changes suggest that there is something different about the content of these protests that requires a different response. Next, treating nearly identical events differently when they involve advocating for Palestinians. We've seen some students do this where they see an event, say we're baking cakes in the quad for Valentine's Day. So students will see that, they'll say, okay, we're going to bake cupcakes in the quad for Palestine. The Valentine's Day event goes on smoothly. The Palestine event gets shut down. Even though they're exactly the same, they take up exactly the same space, but because of the content of the speech, one is treated differently. Next is prohibiting pro-Palestinian slogans. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. saying that phrases like from the river to the sea, or even using the word intifada, is per se offensive, per se anti-Semitic, and therefore violates school policy in a way that no other slogan or no other foreign language phrase is criticized. Next is disciplining students more harshly because of their involvement in pro-Palestinian advocacy as opposed to a different type of advocacy. There's, as we'll talk later, there have been protests on campus is nothing new. And these universities have taken more lenient responses in the past. However, now there is intense pressure to take strong action to show that you are disciplining these students with force. That suggests that, again, there's something different about this speech that is not protected, or they are claiming is not protected. Similarly, reacting to pro-Palestinian protests, including in campus, with more harsher punishment. So that is, again, calling the police where before you would not do such a thing, or issuing suspensions where before it would be a notice and things would move on, or people would be allowed to graduate. Next slide, please. I also want to call your attention to a long-term but increasingly used line of attack on pro-Palestinian speech, and that's what's called material support of terrorism. Recently, there have been numerous lawsuits claiming that all of the pro-Palestinian advocacy you've seen on campus, especially the encampments, are actually coordinated by groups that are receiving their orders directly from Hamas. That is the argument. I am not exaggerating. That is the connection that they are trying to make to suppress this speech. And it has increased substantially this year. It was always an argument that was previously made, but now there's a lot, because there's so much criticism of these protests, there are a lot of bad faith actors using sympathy for Israel to push this line of attack to completely shut down pro-Palestinian advocacy. Now, we are clear we do not believe this will be effective, and we will fight it as much as we can. But we also want to let everyone know that to the extent anyone is arguing that speech is dangerous, the First Amendment does have a test for when speech is not protected, or speech that advocates for violence moves away from First Amendment protection. So it has to be both of these things have to be true. It has to be directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and that speech has to be likely to produce such action. So, for example, if you say the phrase, if you chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is that speech likely to produce or incite any action, especially the eradication of Israel? No. And because it doesn't work. That's an argument that won't work. Next slide, please. Now, what are some legal avenues to challenge this pressure to repress pro-Palestinian speech? The First Amendment requires that any government regulation of speech that is permissible be content neutral and viewpoint neutral. And so what this means is that all protests have to be treated the same, regardless of the viewpoint expressed on the topic or the content of the protest itself. So I provided a few examples of discrimination with respect to protests. With respect to encampments, if there have previously been no issue with encampment on the yard, but once the camp is declared in support of Palestine, now it's a danger to campus safety. If students are allowed to wear IDF military gear or wrap themselves in Israeli flags at the pro-Israel protests, but they can't wear keffeys or Palestinian flags at the pro-Palestine protests. If they are allowed, or maybe they do allow protests, but once the Palestinian side says intifada, all of a sudden that is now a violent protest and is now banned. Whereas any Hebrew phrases or any non-English phrases on the other side are not questioned at all. For commencement, you've seen many people wear their flags at commencement. So if you allow all flags, but specifically ban one flag, that would be content and viewpoint discrimination that is not protected by the First Amendment. And especially if you are at a state school, that is a strong avenue of attack. Next slide, please. Another legal avenue is through Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Title VI prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in any program receiving federal funding. As relevant to this discussion, schools. And since 2004, the Department of Education has repeatedly stated that Title VI protects Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians, as well as Jews and Israelis. It's because Title VI doesn't include the phrase religion, a lot of people assume it does not protect religion, but because there are groups that are targeted because of their religion or their shared religious heritage, that the Department of Education has specifically and repeatedly notified that no, Title VI and the federal anti-discrimination laws do apply to students who are discriminated against because they are Muslim, because they're Palestinian, and because they're Arab. The Department of Education, we want to note, has repeatedly requested complaints for discrimination regarding to anti-Palestinian discrimination on campus, and MLFA has submitted some on behalf of students, and we were able to get the Department of Education to investigate Harvard for its anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab and anti-Muslim discrimination. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk to you about how to look out for discrimination or to protect yourself from a potential Palestine exception to your protests in two specific instances. First, with encampments. The best thing to do is, of course, educate yourself on the rules and policies about camping out on property. If there are rules specific to tents, make sure you follow them. One of the most important things you can do is learn the history of protests at your school. Have there been any encampments or occupations of administrative halls? What was the school's response? I can give an example. Looking at Harvard students have documented the history of protests at Harvard, going back to anti-Vietnam War protests, anti-apartheid protests, Occupy Wall Street protests, similar encampments on campus where students were not disciplined in the same way that they are now. And that will be a grounds for a complaint in the future. Follow any past practice to encampments. If you know that previous encampments have not received any scrutiny, continue to follow that so you can argue, we haven't done anything different. Avoid actual disruptions to campus safety. I say that with the caveat that, of course, they may try to claim that just the existence of the encampment is disruptive to campus safety. But there are obvious ways to ensure that it's actually not disruptive. Make sure people can walk to class. Make sure that class can go on. That doesn't mean you have to be, or don't make noise in the middle of the night. That doesn't mean you have to be silent during the day, but be reasonable, just to provide yourself some cover. And note down any disparity in treatment. If your pro-Palestinian encampment is being punished more harshly, note that down and either file a Title VI complaint or reach out to an attorney to assist you with that. I also have a caveat to prepare for reasonable consequences for civil disobedience. I think there's a point where an encampment will no longer be allowed on campus, I think, at a certain point. And so at some point, depending on your beliefs, of course, it's up to you. What are you willing to sacrifice to continue this protest? Because a school can allow you to speak freely, but they may not allow you to graduate in 4 years. They may require you to do extra steps to complete your degree as a result of your disobedience. They are allowed to enforce their policies. So to the extent that that is a concern for you, if you have, say, future academic opportunities on the line that you don't want to risk, you have to consider that. It's a protest, so there is sacrifice. But it doesn't mean that because an encampment is a more extreme form of protest, there may be more extreme sacrifices that have to be made for your protest to continue. Okay, next slide, please. I also want to talk to you about commencement, another area where we're seeing a lot of protests. Of course, educate yourself on the commencement rules, what's allowed, what disruptions are allowed. A lot of campuses are noting the protests will happen. They may require the protests to be silent or non-disruptive. For example, President Biden just spoke at Morehouse College, and there were rules on what protest was allowed. College said it had to be silent and non-disruptive, and so that happened. People did protest. He also said that if anyone did disrupt, we would just cancel commencement. Those were the terms, and that's what had to be done. But to the most part, most people are allowed to protest silently by either wearing something that signals their allegiance, using, of course, slogans. The less controversial, the better. Um, Writing things on their graduation cap. In general, the greater the disruption to the ceremony, the more likelihood that you will face adverse consequences, and the less disruption, the less likelihood that there will be potential adverse consequences. Okay, next slide, please. So what can you do after the dust is settled? What can you do um, to ensure that your protest was treated fairly? If you're at a public school, first, make sure that you've protested within the reasonable bounds of the First Amendment. The First Amendment does allow there to be reasonable time, manner, and place restrictions. So you can protest at this time frame. Now, reasonable time, say it's 3 to 5 or 3 to 8. It can't be something like you can only protest from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. Thursday nights. That's unreasonable. Object to that. Or you can only protest far, far away on a street where nobody drives by in the field. That's also unreasonable. However, protests that require you to stay away from the street or in a place that protest normally happens, comply with those rules as they are reasonable. And then, of course, always assert your right to First Amendment protection when you see discriminatory treatment. Just because the school is violating those rights does not mean you don't have them, and you should insist on upholding those rights. For private schools, you should still ensure that your protest is within bounds of the First Amendment, but with the caveat that some schools are not required to give you the full First Amendment protection. So learn the history of the protests on your own campus. What has happened before and what's been the response? Insist on making your campus live up to its promises. If they advertise about how they have allowed protests and protest is a big part of the campus tradition, insist on the administration keeping that promise. Remind them that this is what they've advertised. This is what students of Columbia have done. That Columbia advertises itself as a place where you can protest. Doesn't seem to be that way anymore. And then when there is discrimination, please use the law. That's just because discrimination has occurred doesn't mean you have to let it stand. I think that's something we've just been insistent to our students about. And luckily, there's a lot lower barriers to entry for certain legal avenues. Making a Title VI complaint, you can do on your own. You don't necessarily need an attorney to do that. But filing a lawsuit, of course, we can assist, or any other attorney can assist. I think that's it. Of course, if you have any requests for legal assistance, I've got our information for our civil litigation department here, and I welcome any questions. Guess I'll read. There's a question in the chat. Question 1, how many people have questions about what protesting means for students, especially if there is disciplinary actions taken, but what does it mean for teachers and staff? This is a very good question. So obviously, there's still the same private public school distinction as to what First Amendment speech is allowed. And then there's also the employment relationship. So there may be, there's another statute called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination in employment. So to the extent that teachers are being treated differently because of their race, national origin, religion, etc., they can file that, at least by their employer. Whether Title VI applies to them is a bit weird. Honestly, people are looking into that, trying to figure that out, because Title VI is vague. It talks about discrimination for any program receiving federal assistance. To the extent that you are a participant in a program, you should be entitled to the same protections as everybody else, based on your race or shared heritage. So to the extent that Palestinian, just as an example, Palestinian teachers are being disciplined for speaking up about Palestine, but Jewish teachers are not being disciplined for speaking about Israel, that would be an example of discrimination. However, I think it's not as clear to the extent that teachers are protected. And then I didn't mention this, but of course, there's also tenure issues. If you're tenured, you probably have more protection in your speech than if you're not. You're probably on a contract, and that contract may have certain grounds for discipline that do not provide the same free speech rights. Okay. Question 2. If I'm involved in a protest on campus and accused of trespassing, what can I do as a student following these allegations? So first, for the actual trespassing charge, that will be a criminal matter that we would direct to a criminal attorney. Those will most likely be state claims as well. However, with that said, we would also look at the history of, you could still make a civil complaint, as we've talked about with Title VI, where we look at the history of how protests have been treated, were past protests resulting in expulsions and trespassing charges, or is this an escalation? And if so, if it's an escalation, let's make that argument. Let's get the Department of Education involved, or let's file a lawsuit under Title VI to claim that the school is not actually treating all of its students the same.
Hi, Chelsea, thank you so much for your presentation. I think we had one more question in the chat there that I saw that I'll throw to you, which is, what about people who are allies but not Palestinian or even Muslim? Are there any protections that still apply to them?
Yes, we have made and continue to make the argument that, let me back a bit. The law protects actual or perceived membership. And one of what we've seen is that people who are, say, members of SJP are perceived, and they wear a kafaya. They're targeted just by virtue of being analogous to or allied to these pro-Palestinian organizations, and then treated the same as a result. And so that's the argument, that it's the connection to Palestine that is changing the way you're treated, and your involvement and your solidarity with Palestinians is causing you to be treated like one. That's what we would argue.
Okay, and then I think one more question just from myself, because I know you've been working kind of more directly with a lot of these students. We have, I think, nearly 25 to 30 students that we're working with at MLFA now. What has been kind of a lesson for you in terms of tips for these students and anyone in the future who is maybe going through these types of difficulties with campuses, or those who they thought they kind of would protect their rights in this way? What has been the most helpful thing that the students have done to be able to help you guys in terms of being able to do your work in your case, whether documentation or, what's the best practices you've seen or things you wish that they did a little bit more of from the student side?
Of course, that's a great question. I think what I was most struck by was the extent to which they banded together. I think they realized what was happening pretty quickly and started to support each other. Alumni also helped out. I think that's the community saw what was happening to these students and reached out, and then got them to start, tracking everything. One thing that I encourage students to do is to at least try the college administrative process or their resolution process, mostly so that you can preserve the record, because then it can say, okay, we've shown the school XYZ and they did nothing. And that is the biggest, that's because then we can make the argument to the Department of Education that they've had all of these complaints and they've responded with either silence or with it's not a big deal. And that's an action by the school that they've done. And we can say, well, they're responsible for these students and treating them like everyone else, and they clearly are not doing that. That's probably the thing I would encourage students to do. I think that's something that some people, you kind of give up on the system and you're like, well, what's the point? I complain, it goes nowhere. The point of complaining is so that in the future, when the judge then turns to the side, oh, well, here, I see that you've gotten this complaint. Why didn't you do anything?
Yeah. Oh, awesome. I definitely learned a lot, I think, and I learned a lot kind of working beside you here of all these cases that kind of come through our way. So thank you, Chelsea, for your time. Thank you for being here with us. And, as you mentioned, folks, you can look back at the slide to see if anyone needs to contact MLFA and your team as well if they're going through anything with student encampments or anything that is related to our work. So thank you so much, Chelsea, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this town hall. We've done a series of these over the last week and a half or so. I think this is our 7th or 8th one. And they'll be available very shortly online if you haven't registered already for the previous ones. We have one more tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central. That is legal traps regarding protesting, strange and unusual laws to watch out for. Again, my name is Jawad Khan from Muslim Legal Fund of America, which is a nonprofit legal fund that for over 20 years has been dedicated to defending Muslim civil rights and liberties at the federal level. We're fighting for equality and justice for American Muslim organizations and individuals by promoting legal compliance and protecting their rights concerning national security and constitutional law as well. Once again, thank you all who are joining us live. We have quite a few folks here live with us, and spread the link around after this. It's going to be recorded and available to be able to spread and share. And again, please register in RSVP and join us for tomorrow's last town hall with us, which again is at 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central. You can find that at MLFA.org with more info. And you can also support our work. Once again, we're a nonprofit organization, and we work to provide as much as we can these services pro bono to these students and to anyone else who's kind of coming to work with us on these federal cases. And so we depend and rely on the community support for our work. And so please go to MLFA.org to learn more and to donate generously, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair, everybody. Take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.